Hello everyone. So I just wanted to touch base before this video to let you know that this is still from the previous stream, which means the camera is going to be fluffy and weird. I'm currently working with Logitech to get the issue fixed, but yesterday they tried to tell me it was a lighting issue. Then I was like, no, we've done it in perfect lighting. Right now it seems to be working, and it seems to keep going in and out. They're planning on replacing it, so hopefully we'll have that fixed and won't have to keep dealing with this intermittently. Also figured out what the sound issue was, so I apologize if this sounds tinny or distant. I tried to fix as much I could in post. If you are a person who is skilled in audio or things like that, and you have some time you wouldn't mind putting towards a project, I guess let us know, because it would be nice to have some help with this stuff. Ideally, I'd like to get us to the point where we're big enough that, like, hiring editors would be really cool, but we're just not there yet, so yeah. Anywho. Remember to like and subscribe and enjoy the video. Bye. Folks, so I'm bringing this up not to point any fingers. I'm not trying to like throw anyone under the bus, but I will admit that this idea came up because of a conversation I'm currently in the middle of on Twitter. I'm not going to say the person's name, but there's a friend of mine who, or at least an acquaintance, who I've had some negative interactions with over Twitter, because Twitter is a place that breeds hate. And one of the things that was an accusation against me was that I had projected something. Okay, I'm willing to hear that. But then I started thinking about it and noticing that in a lot of the discussions I see with, all these different streamers and all these different people, they talk about projection, and yet they don't really talk about projection in a meaningful way. And I'm going to throw this out there. I actually think the left really sucks at definitions, and I think they really suck at definitions about psychological terms, and I'd like them to stop, please. Now, if you're a little bit old to this channel, you've been around for a minute, can we get a Jess Hypers in chat if you remember the video about gaslighting? Do you remember us going over the term gaslighting and its actual meaning, and the fact that when most people say it, they're actually just talking out their ass?
Or they're using it to mean something different.
Yes, they're essentially saying, because you remember it differently than I do, you're trying to convince me otherwise or make me feel crazy. If you haven't seen that video, after this video, you should go back and see that. It's a good video. So, in that video, what we talked about was that the term gaslighting refers to a process that is done through manipulation. Essentially, what it requires is the use of some sort of positive form of manipulation, usually a positive incentive. Love bombing is a really a common one. And through the power of love bombing, you get the person really well on your side, and then when they start to go against what you're doing, you start to then pull away, you leave them feeling emotionally and socially isolated, and then you can start sort of trying to convince them that their memory of things is wrong. Oh, I never hit you, you're making that up, why do you always do this to me? All that kind of crazy shit. That is the more clinical understanding of gaslighting. It's a cult-based term, or a term used in much more severely abusive relationships. But in the online left, gaslighting gets referred to as any time you disagree with me on a memory, which again, memory is unreliable, so this is a weird take. Or people basically starting to say things like, because you disagree with me, that's gaslighting, when that's not how that works at all. Like, even a little bit. Similarly with projection, what a lot of the online left seems to do is say the word projection, and they have no idea what the fuck they're on about. So the way I've heard it used, and this is probably what you've heard before, correct, Tiamat. Essentially, actual gaslighting requires the establishment of a form of trust or authority in order to back up the attempt to deny reality. Correct, because you're essentially doing a weird yo-yo effect. Just disagreeing with someone's memory on something or lying about something is not gaslighting. And denying another person's reality is not the same thing as disagreeing with them. These are clear terms. I actually had a friend
I think I mentioned in that video who I lost because I had a different memory or a different take on things, and they immediately got triggered and thought I was gaslighting them, when in reality it was I disagreed. I actually think sometimes people throw out the term gaslighting as a manipulative tactic to try to win the argument. I'll be perfectly honest. If there's no real evidence psychologically of real gaslighting, it would be very easy for someone to throw that out there and just use this in a manipulative format. And we've seen this before where people, especially people of a more abusive bend, will use mental health terms as a way to bend others to what they want. This happens a lot in couples therapy when you have someone who is much more abusive than to the other person. And often when they get to therapy, they'll actually try to ally with the therapist. They'll be really buddy-buddy. They'll really cry crocodile tears about the things that they've been through, all the while the victim is being negatively impacted, right? And losing connection to the therapist by definition help. So it's no bueno. In the case of projection, what most people seem to think it means is you're taking an idea or a meaning you've made and putting it onto me. I am assuming your intention. That's what I hear projection is. You're projecting this onto me means that I am putting something onto you that isn't yours. And to me, I can say that's assumption. I can say that's a bad faith criticism. I can say that it is me overly inferring what I think you mean. And I'll even go so far to say could be projective. But notice that I said could. The reason I say that is because projection at its core is this. Projection is the process of displacing one's feelings onto a different person, animal, or object. The term is most commonly used to describe defensive projections, attributing one's own unacceptable urges to one another. For example, if someone continuously bullies and ridicules a peer about his insecurities, the bully might be projecting his own struggle with self-esteem onto the other person. So to put this into perspective, what this is basically saying is, let's say there's a part of yourself that you don't like. I'll use anger as the example. You ever seen that guy in a thing where you're like, dude, calm down, you're getting angry, and they just belt out and yell at you like, F you, I'm not angry? Or the people that'll be saying, I'm not angry, you're angry? I know we do that as a joke now, like you're this or you're that, you're a frog, whatever. But the actual projection here is when we take something about ourselves that we have insecurity around or we don't like about ourselves. Namely that if you're a person who's really, really angry, but you have a lot of stories and beliefs around the idea of, anger bad, that then you project that onto the other person. You put the attributes of that thing you're running from onto the other. So for me to be projecting, there would have to be some amount of psychological material I would be lobbing at the other person. An assumption I'm making that's not just an assumption, but has to do with my own internal insecurities, difficulties, flaws, or concerns. Right? So unconscious discomfort can lead people to attribute unacceptable feelings or impulses to someone else to avoid confronting them. This is part of the Gestalt therapy video too. If you go back and look at the cycle of awareness video, I know it's a long ago in the video and the video's awful and it's terrible, but go back and watch it. What essentially it argues is this is one of the several ways that people avoid the cycle of awareness. In that video, I talked about Gestalt therapy and the way that Gestalt talks about a cycle of awareness. That is, everything that comes into experience is essentially moved through that cycle of experience as long as nothing gets in the way. But if something happens, such as shoving your own stuff down, trying to just get along, go along to get along, or putting your own uncomfortable stuff on another person, that's where the cycle gets stuck, and it tends to get stuck in working memory. This is true, or not working memory, but it tends to get stuck in the mind. The EMDR version of this is like essentially a trauma, either big T or little t trauma, getting stuck in the mind, in working memory or some other thing, depending on the framework. So what we're talking about here is the process of misinterpreting what is inside as coming from outside. yes, it's a form of sort of psychological redirection. It forms the basis of empathy by the projection of personal experiences to understand someone else's subjective world. Because human beings have to connect associationally, and especially neurodiverse people do this, to understand things, there is a way that there can be a glitch in that system to sort of take a part of ourselves, and rather than recognize that it is something the other person is dealing with, and by extension we have empathy for if we're okay with that part of ourselves, we just put it onto them. Now, they may or may not have that trait or not. We don't know. We're too busy projecting. It is a defense mechanism which the ego defends itself against disowned and highly negative parts of the self by denying their existence in themselves and attributing them to others, breeding misunderstanding and causing untold interpersonal damage. Right? So like, projection incorporates blame shifting and can manifest as shame dumping. Projection has been described as an early phase of introjection. Okay, we'll talk about introjection another time. But the thing I really want you to take from this is that the idea is practical examples. Victim blaming. The victim of someone else's actions or bad luck may be often offered criticism. The theory being that the victim may be at fault for having attracted the other person's hostility. In such cases, the psyche projects the experiences of weakness or vulnerability with the aim of ridding itself of the feelings and, through its disdain for them or the act of blaming, their conflict with the ego. Okay, so what that means in layman's terms is that essentially, think about every time we talk about trigger warning for sexual assault, whenever we talk about rape, one of the things we talk about within rape culture, rape apologia, this is the thing that happens. We see people start to victim blame. Why was she wearing that skirt? You know, how dare you go to a club? Why did you set your drink down? There's a tendency of humans, sometimes in good faith, sometimes not, to sort of attributively put the experiences or the effects of responsibility on the person where there is none. I'll be really clear. I don't care if you show up to a party or a club buck-ass naked. It doesn't matter what you're doing. The moment someone pushes it to the point where you no longer have volition, it's not your fault. Full stop. Done. End of discussion. One can make discussions about situations that we're in and ways to avoid certain situations, which unfortunately has to happen a lot with women. There sadly has to be those discussions. But that does not in any way make them responsible for the things that are happening. Ramsey Bolton, thank you so much for subscribing. So, you take that part of yourself and you put it onto the other person. So you blame them. That fear that it could be your fault then makes it then the victim's fault. This happens a lot where people will start calling into question that person's character. This is why coming out as a rape victim is so hard, because you get scrutinized so deeply. This is why only like around 50% of women actually report, because they're so afraid of what could happen. Other examples here of projection of hope, also in a more positive light, a patient may sometimes project their feelings of hope onto the therapist. Fair, that can happen. Sometimes a person can be so overly hopeful that they can't see reality. That's definitely a thing. It is essentially a form of scapegoating. It's a way to sort of defer responsibility, right? Women are to blame for their own subjugation because of their bad choices. Poor people are just choosing to be poor. There must be something about Black cultures that these are all stories created by which to blame the victim rather than look at the systems around them. They talk about marital guilt here. Yep, absolutely. You can project positive things. You can project lots of things, but scapegoating is one flavor it comes in. This is absolutely correct. I gotta remember to list the important person symbol. Remind me. Bullying is another example. We talked about that. Now, in therapy terms, the way we talk about these are such terms as transference and countertransference. Transference is when a client puts stuff onto the therapist. They project things onto them. This is where they can sometimes get hero worshipy or creepy or even start thinking there's romantic feelings where there is none. Projection can easily create these circumstances where because they've transferred all of these feelings or these needs, like say the person didn't have a good father figure, they may transfer that onto a male therapist, they might needed more mother's care, etc. They will transfer that. Now, countertransference is when the therapist does it to the client. This happens sometimes where the client will project, or the therapist will project on the client some of their own insecurities or some of their own difficulties. This is actually one of the reasons why I make it very clear to every therapist I come in contact with, are you doing therapy? If you're not, why not? Because we have to look out for this stuff. The more personal work you do, the less likely you are to engage in countertransference. So we have to be really clear on that. This can happen in lots of situations. There's a book that my therapist recommended to me, which I'm still working through, which is called Sex in the Forbidden Zone. And it's a book talking about positions of power and how sex can happen there, either between clinician and client, or doctor and client, or teacher and student, etc. Now, we're not talking about in case of situations involving minors, things like that. That's a very different system. But if we're talking about two adults, power dynamics still exist, and they still have ways that they can manipulate the situation. This was an issue within Zen. One of the things I'd often see from Dharma siblings was anytime we talked about the abuses of my teacher's teacher, that is, the ways that he used his position to gain sexual favor, one of the things that often would come up is, well, these were adult women. They had choices. They could have just left, which is literally the dumbest statement that anyone has ever said. Your literal guru, your literal person that you see as having enlightenment. And let me be clear, Edo Shimano Roshi was fucking awake, but being awake is different than being morally developed. This is something I think Integral does well. It's one of the areas I don't have a critique in. Personal development is different than spiritual development. Someone can be incredibly spiritually refined and clear and be absolutely monstrous. Now, Edo Shimano was more complicated than that, but that's essentially the idea. And for someone in my order to say, well, these were women, this was not, is literally just rape culture. It's apologia. So the book goes into discussions about that. Projection is when we look at those situations and say those things. In the case of my Dharma brother, what he's doing in that circumstance is projecting onto these women, saying that they had full autonomy, but ignoring the fact that, they're up in a monastery in the middle of nowhere with a guy who's supposed to be protecting everybody and who is the teacher, and there's these power dynamics. Very hyper-individualistic people, especially men, love to pretend that these sort of social ecology things aren't real. It's real cringe. We'll bring on Beyonce for it's about this sometime. So one of the things that I think is important is to look at criticism. Some studies were critical of Freud's theory. Research, now granted, projection's also talked about in Gestalt theory. I know Jung talks about it. This is not just Freud, but research on social projection supports the existence of false consensus effects whereby humans have a broad tendency to believe that others are similar to themselves, thus project their personality traits onto others. This applies to both good and bad traits. It is not a defense mechanism for denying the existence of the traits within the self. So at that point, you get into a little bit of a definitional error. Projection is when you take something you're running away from on yourself onto the other. But this type of false consensus effect where you're like, well, everyone must be a white, heterosexual, cis Christian like myself, that's a problem. So understand this is that this can get complicated. Sometimes when we're pointing out things, it may be that the other person can't understand your experience, but that isn't necessarily a projection. This is just sort of not being able to see traits that aren't part of yourself. It's actually kind of the reverse. Look, there are theories that say that all human interactions will, with anything involve prediction. Prediction can be complicated. Absolutely can, list, no argument. Projection gets real complicated and it can be a mind trap. What I'm saying is that lefties use this term incorrectly because anytime there is an attempt to attribute someone's views or anything on them, it is immediately assumed projection without any evidence. And that's where my concern is that people will throw out these psychological terms to strengthen their arguments. I'm being gaslit. You're projecting. But that's not the case. Do you have anything you want to add to this? Your thoughts on projection?
No, just I think it's very easy to not use the right words for the situation and to use the words that feel convenient or feel right.
Like I did in the early part of the stream.
Yeah. And I guess Justin and I generally advocate for using accurate language because this is, one way to kind of avoid some of the stigma with mental health. Because there are a lot of cases where, like, hey, maybe these two people in a relationship aren't great and the relationship's not working out. Does that mean that it's abuse? No. Could there be other things going on? Could it be really bad for both people? Yeah, but that doesn't mean that it's abuse, right? There might be just other things going on that's creating a lot of tension. But if you tell that couple, like, hey, you're abused, now you've inserted all sorts of other stuff. So, there's a lot of cases where I think using more accurate language is better. Especially for this stuff.
No, absolutely.
And so throwing out projection just, at people on the internet or when you're losing a conversation or, mixing in this stuff when you're having, a debate about a topic with somebody really kind of breaks down what these words mean and throws in more, concepts and stuff than maybe you really mean to in that moment. Yeah. So I think that's about
your take? Nice.
Yeah.
So a couple other things here. So in Good Therapy, and this is just an interesting blog. I've gotten some good insights from it. They talk about 3 types. Let's see how we like them. Neurotic projection is the most common variety of projection and most clearly meets the definition of a defense mechanism. In this type of projection, people may attribute feelings, motives, attitudes they find unacceptable in themselves to someone else. 2, complementary projection occurs when individuals assume others feel the same way they do. For example, a person with a particular political persuasion might take it for granted that friends and family members share those beliefs. Not such Trump. Complementary projection is the assumption other people can do the same things as well as oneself. For example, an accomplished pianist might take it for granted that other piano students can play as equally well. So one thing I want to point out with these is this is sort of our normal definition of projection. This right here is something I see a lot with libs, and this is the idea that everybody shares these same views, that, this is the post-history, everybody's just trying to figure out the best way to do these things, everyone's coming from a good place. This is nonsense. You're assuming things about people that are sometimes monsters. Nazis, fascists, conservatives, but I repeat myself, are by definition not sharing our same beliefs. They reject the Enlightenment. They reject the actual ideas of liberty. Complementary projection, actually, I'll be honest, this is ableism. Think about it. If I see somebody struggling with, say, chronic illness like we do, if they have chronic migraines and illness, I may assume, and I've even gotten into this a few times, struggling with dealing with it, even us dealing with these things, sometimes I would get really frustrated because I didn't understand why Zena couldn't do a thing until I kind of had to, again, like I've said in other videos, kick myself in the butt and go, okay, I need to be more inclusive and understanding about this. Clearly there's something I'm not getting. And the thing I wasn't getting is I was doing this. I was assuming that everyone goes as hard on things as I do. I was assuming everyone tries as hard on things as I do, or is able to do the same things because I assumed the same level of capability. But that's just bullshit. No one has the same level of capability on a thing. And to assume that a person with chronic illness is in fact ableism.
Well, and especially with migraines, we know that every person is different with them. Every person is unique. What works for one person doesn't work for another person.
Absolutely.
So just as migraines don't look the same, as mine do. Although there's similarities in a lot of cases, they're not always exactly the same.
So, and here's where one of my frustrations comes up. This last point, and this is why I wanted to bring this site up. Sigmund Freud, his coked ass, believed projection to be a defense mechanism often used as a way to avoid uncomfortable, repressed feelings. Feelings that are projected may be controlled and jealous by nature. We know this, right? But this is the part that's important. Projection, one main mechanism of paranoia, is also frequently a symptom of narcissistic and borderline personalities. We'll get back to that. A person with narcissistic traits who does not respect their partners may say to their partners, "You don't respect me or see my self-worth." Some individuals with borderline personality may be afraid of losing the people they love, and project this fear by frequently accusing friends and partners of planning to leave. However, individuals who project their feelings in this way do not necessarily have either of those conditions. So, yeah, the autism would easily fit into that, Tiamat. But the reason I'm bringing this one piece up, and this is just a personal bitch for me, I realize that criteria 9 of the DSM shows that borderline has paranoia. I'm a person with borderline. I'm diagnosed with that. I'm very open about that. But what I want to make very clear here is I'm going to start getting a little salty about people accusing me of projection. Unless you can point out the psychological material you think I'm running from, that gets dangerously close to really weird stuff about borderline. Because if I'm open about that, and I'm clear about that with people, and then I get a bunch of people saying I'm projecting on them, I don't know. Something about that really, really hits me the wrong way. What does Chad think? Because I'd be really curious as to what people are thinking about this. I with you. Cool? I'm just wondering, like, am I on the right path here where it's like, again, it's like when people overly project the whole, like, struggle with socialization or, like, the emotion stuff on autistic people. Like, that's just ableistic crap. The alternative to projection is seeing things clearly and everybody involved owning their shit. Fucking true. Yeah, so even if it's not intentional, the idea of suddenly saying something is projective to a person with borderline feels like the same thing that autistic people get, or the same stuff ADHD people get. Like, that feels really weird to me. So I guess I just want to kind of end this here, but I wanted to see if, like, maybe I'm on the right track with that last piece. It's not to win an argument. It's not to, like, make a point. It's not to do anything. It's just, I feel like it does put me in a weird position of, like, and this is something I get into with Zena a lot, where I'll sometimes get really upset because I feel like there's an assumption of my intentions. And I realize that intention is not the whole thing. Sometimes bad things happen without our intentions. And I have to own those things still. The fact is that, like, there's a difference between the bad thing happening regardless and saying you know what my intentions are, because that's really weird. Like knowing someone that takes psychiatric medication and asking them if they took their pills when they're unhappy with you. Yeah, that one can get real gross real quick. There are times when that's called for, but it's really, really dodgy. But
no, that's generally one that you kind of play that line with to make sure your loved ones are okay, but also you need enough rapport to not, make them feel really shitty in that scenario. There are lots of ways to ask that question better to people if you're concerned. So.
Absolutely. Last thing Liz said was, like, yes, borderline people can be paranoid and autistic people can misread social cues, but the debate should be about the accuracy of analysis, not the mind of the assessor. True. And so, yeah, I'm going to say this real quick. We're all going to screw this up. We all have preconceived notions. We all tend to do this thing where we sort of take our preconceived notions and put these things onto people. And that's a form of psychological material. But if you're going to accuse me of projection, you best know what that is. In the same way of saying that, I don't ever try to tell my mods, because a couple of my mods deal with autism. I really go out of my way to make sure I never say, I think you're missing this situation. I might say I don't get that take, or I don't understand, but I really don't want to put that on them. They may disagree. That's my experience of it. I don't know. But that is something I want to put out there, is that, like, my goal is to always try to not bring that into the system unless they think that's a thing. I trust their experience more than my observation. Therapists can and do project all the time. Our clinical training is all about understanding and owning our projections. True.
I will say projection's not, like, the worst thing in the world. Like, it happens incidentally, Like, there are things where that just happens. It's not, world ending.
Sure. But the thing is that, like, yeah, like, you are it's not the end of the world, but if you're going to claim someone's doing a thing, you need to come with data. You need to tell me how you arrived at that conclusion.
Yeah, no, especially when you're dealing with people on the internet. I think it's just one of those. It really does kind of turn into a deflection and this assumption that like there's something else going on. Yeah.
So with that, we're going to end this. Yeah, don't use Twitter. I'd be curious on feedback from my mods just to make sure I'm not talking out my butt. But other than that, I'm going to end this one here. I'll see you guys in the next one. We love you. See you later. Bye.
Bye.
If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe. Also, consider donating to us. You can support us on our website, transgirltherapist.org. You can also help us on our Patreon, link below, or you can become a member here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching.